Hello, pioneers! Welcome to my channel. I'd like to say we're all pioneers exploring the uncharted territories of higher consciousness, and that we are definitely echoes of all the generations before us, as well as the echo to all the generations that will come after us. Listen, folks, if these are end days, which I know they are, and we're to inherit the earth and God's new creation, and we're to be a new creation, transformed, then we want to burn off our ancestral karma. Right? We want to release what the generations before us has left us to inherit, and we want to bless the 1,000, at least 1,000 generations after us, right? By breaking familial patterns, behaviors, and limited thinking. So the spiritual community tends to tell us to reach out to our ancestors for guidance. Do you ever think, how does this benefit our ancestors by doing this? If they're happy and in heaven or not, does it benefit them to reach out to us? Why would they help us? Right? Why are they invested or still connected to you? It's because you are their legacy, right? And so I believe we're all connected, and that's not a woohoo thing. I'll do other videos that explain in more detail how physicists have discovered that all matter is connected, right? Specifically, all humans. We are all a family species. Did you know that we have 99% identical DNA? It's only 1% of our DNA that differentiates us from each other. Our looks, our characters, our traits. 1%. We have all identical DNA that is 99% identical beyond that. So it is an illusion, folks, that we are separated. In fact, if you take any person on the planet, take one person anywhere on the planet, scientists say you are only 20 generations from finding familial DNA with that person. We are all sharing the same bloodlines, all of us. So, with that in mind, I want to also talk about, they've also taken cells, and they found that the neurons are stimulated in connection with each other. Well, let's just say twins, right? You take one twin, you put them on one side of the planet, take another twin, put them on the other side of the planet. Usually when you are affecting one twin, the other twin will react or behave or be affected by whatever you're doing to the other twin, even if you don't know you have a twin, right? And you'll say, yeah, but those are twins. Okay. But the point is, if we are all connected, right? We all share to some degree, even if it's one cell in our body, and those other people in other bodies, their cells are being affected by some kind of stimulation. Somehow, energetically, it is affecting our cells. If you take a frog, two different frogs aren't related to each other, and you take their little beating heart tissue cells and you put them in the same petri dish, they'll both stop and start beating together, because scientifically the cells want to be connected to each other and react in balance with each other. That's why the mother's heartbeat is always matching the child's heartbeat. When you're with a lover, your heartbeats will beat to the same rhythm. That kind of thing is what I'm referring to. I remember when I was about 10 years old, my mother got into a car wreck. Now, she was an alcoholic, so my father had a second job. He was a armed guard at a hospital. He would work nights, and she liked to party, so she would wait till I go to sleep, and she would go out and party. And one day I woke up, one night, I was sleeping at night. I woke up and I just knew something was wrong with her. I woke up out of a sound sleep, paced the house, couldn't find her. I knew she had been out, and I was worried. I started to feel a dread. Within a half an hour, the police called and asked for my father. I said, he's at work. What's going on? And I was a child. They said, well, is there another adult there with you? And I said, no. And they said, oh, well, your mother was in a car accident, and we're trying to get a hold of your father. Do you have his work number? And I knew where to find that, so I gave that to them. But I had to wait until morning when my father came home to find out she, in fact, had been in a car wreck, broke her leg. They had to do the claws of life to get her out. It was pretty dramatic. But it was amazing. I told my dad, wow, I knew something was wrong. I woke up a half hour before the police called. I really felt in my bones something was going on. So that's just like one example. So as our fellow humans on the planet are being oppressed or, in wars or things like that, I mean, you might want to say, well, we're or starving, and people can say, well, that's just human empathy. Yes, but perhaps human empathy comes from the fact that we share cells with these people. Cell memory is in our memory, and maybe that's a calling from God. Help your people, send money, do something to be supportive. Anyway, I digress. So if our loved ones pass on, there's so much I need to cover. So I believe, right, if our loved ones pass on, they no longer have a human form. So they don't have human cells. But what is matter? If energy does not deplete and go away, then their energy remains. Energy is known as nuclear, right? Nuclear energy. So the energy still has cells that are atoms, right? There's still positive and negative energy fields in their energy, so there's still atomic structures. Here's how we're gatekeepers of each other. So we're on the planet, living our experience in the 3D, in the body, and as we heal and as we clear karma, and God can be in past, present, and future, right? Time is an illusion. He sees that we're healing. Cellularly, the karma is released for our ancestors. They become more divine. They become in union with God. Obviously, their energy field is going to be of a higher vibration. It's got to affect the cells in our body, right? That just goes to reason. It's like a circle. Again, a familial circle. If you take a circle, right? Any point of that circle is the beginning and the end at that point, right? So every person on the circle is its own beginning and end point. But yet there is no beginning and end to the circle. Maybe that's too deep. I digress again. So let's say we're healing and we're overcoming all of our karma. Our ancestors then, if they weren't able to heal and burn off their karma, their choice was then to pass it down to you in your cells, and you hold the torch now to do the work. Okay. So they are invested in you because you as you heal and you burn off karma, it's as if their karma then also had been healed, because our cells are the same. So they want you to heal and to ascend, to raise your vibration, to overcome oppression and limited self-beliefs, because it benefits them as well. Same thing goes for the generations that come, right? Okay. I remember reading a book that Saint Faustina wrote, and she had asked Jesus about suicide. And she said, I've spent all this time talking with you, and you seem so loving and adoring and merciful. What about people who reach a place where they're hopeless, overwhelmed, stricken with darkness, and they don't see hope? Perhaps they are not, whether they are or not, let's just say they are not strengthened in spirituality, therefore they can't feel their divine value, and so they would rather just stop fighting the good fight here on the earth, and they want to go to heaven. Well, a lot of religions teach that if you commit suicide, that you are not going to heaven. That how dare you choose when you're going to leave the planet? That only God is the creator, and that's murder on yourself, right? And so she was concerned with that. She said, what happens to the souls that are that desperate and just want to be held by you and can't take the pains of life anymore? And his response to her was, well, that's why prayer is so important. Because, now I don't know word for word what he said or what she wrote, but what she was trying to say was, let's say a mother, let's just say I'm a mom and my son commits suicide. And let's say he wasn't in union with God, and he felt hopeless, and he took his life. And I then began to pray for mercy for his soul and ask God to forgive him and, accept him into the Christian family and have mercy on his soul. Well, according to Saint Faustina, God receives those prayers. And since he is not limited by time, past, present, and future, he can go back to the time right before the person's soul leaves the body. He can come to them and ask them, do you believe in me? Do you believe? Now this is Jesus. So he said, do you believe I'm your Savior and that I can take you to heaven and save your soul? Do you believe I'm the gateway to my Father? And if that soul were to say yes in passing, then they would be redeemed. And that was very comforting, I think, for millions of people to hear. And it's just a wonderful thing to think that God has mercy and anything is possible, and we don't know how he thinks. And it just goes to show you the importance of prayer. Pray for all those that have died before you. Pray for all those that are to come after you, as well as the ones that are here on earth fighting the good fight with you, and as well as for yourself. Well, what I'm saying is, we are all connected. We have so much power. If we believe that there is a God and a creator, and we can intercede for our loved ones, it is extremely powerful. Therefore, the ones that have passed on are rooting for us as well as we should be rooting for them. We need to get out of our ego. We need to be realizing that we are an ecosystem of human beings. We should be praying for all our brothers and sisters on the planet, everyone that has passed. How hard is it to include every human being that has ever lived and ask God to have mercy on their souls? You don't have to name them by name. He knows who they are. So the importance of prayer is also highlighted. And I say, pray for your ancestors, because they may be praying for you wherever they are. And if they're in a higher place, God may just have mercy on your soul because they've asked him to. So understand that you have the power to ask for guidance from them. They are invested in you. You're their legacy. And we are the next generation's legacy, right? So moving on, I do think it's very important for you to do research about your ancestry. Well, just from a personal aspect, before I started my healing process, I realized I had a lot of abandonment issues. And that's for lots of reasons. But when you start researching your roots, something that happens spiritually where you feel like you belong. And, I was adopted by my father. I did know my natural mother, but before they adopted me together, I was with a foster family. And so you could say, that's impossible. I don't even know my real family. I was adopted. I'll never know who they are. That doesn't mean you can't do research on people whom you love, right? I truly believe, and I loved my foster family on a way deeper level than I ever was able to experience with my biological mother, right? And so if I didn't know my natural parents, I don't know my natural father. I never will, so I can't do research with his family. I was very lucky and blessed to know where my mother came from and have historical accounts and do research. And I was very blessed as a child to go to Ireland. My mother was born in Ireland, and so I was able to go there and experience what my ancestors, the land that my ancestors were from, right? But my point is, if I had never experienced that, I would have been just as excited to do research of my foster's family, because I was spiritually their child. My foster mother was a mother to me. I loved her, and we had a familial connection. We were spiritually connected. And I would have claimed her family's bloodline as my own in order to feel as if I was part of that clan, right? So the family that God puts you in, or the family you create, you can do DNA tests and find out what nationality you are, and what area of the world you're from, and do the research from there on. You don't have to have names. You can study the history of the land and the people. You can go there and touch the soil and eat the food that your ancestors ate. You can breathe in the air that they did and look on the landscape and know that you're looking at, maybe they didn't have the same buildings 5,000 years ago, but the land was there. You're walking on the same land that your ancestors did. So I encourage people to look into your ancestors if you have family, start asking questions. Have a dinner or go over and have, you know, have people over to your house that are related to you and say, let's pull out the picture book, or let's all write down stories that we know about who knows anything about our ancestors, who knows anything about grandma. If you still have grandma alive, my goodness, that's a treasure wealth, right? Ask her questions. What do you know about your parents? What about their parents? It's a journey. Look at it like a journey where every single thing you discover is another clue to who you are and where you came from, what your people went through. I don't care if it was 3,000 years ago. Guess what? That traumatic experience, or that wonderful, magical, they were kings and queens, that's in your blood. Those experiences, how those cells in their bodies reacted to the good or the bad or the ugly, are in your cells. It's there somewhere. There's cell recognition. So feed the soul, do research, see if you can dig into history. And if not, who's your spiritual family, right? Who's your spiritual family? You have to have somebody. And if you feel even a spiritual draw to a certain, let's say you're Mexican, but you're just mesmerized and always been interested in the Chinese dynasty. You don't know, maybe your family's from there. Do research, feel connected. If you find a Chinese person, only 20 generations will exist between you and them until you're connected by a bloodline. So pick any person on the planet, go back 20 generations and study the ancestry. See what I'm saying? I mean, there's a lot of wonderful hidden treasures to be found in doing the research. And so, human history, of course, has been complicated with migration, wars, famine, separation of families, traumas, and over the centuries, real accounts of history can be lost, right? What makes ancestral exploration powerful is to imagine, like I said, like it's a lifelong treasure hunt. Find out where your people and family are from. Learn about their homeland. Learn the history of the land. Get a deeper sense of the place so that you can capture what your people experienced. My dog is chewing on a bone, so if you hear that noise, that's the bone hitting the floor. The more you can identify with specific towns even that they're from, the easier it is for you to transport yourself, right, to the experience of your ancestors that were living there. I had access to family stories, and I was blessed to have been able to go to Ireland as a child. I talked with my grandparents. I have had many conversations with my aunts, who all recalled different stories of our family. And I began painting a wonderful picture that is now etched on my heart of experiences that my ancestors lived through. So I wanted to connect more deeply, right, with my ancient grandmother's side. Well, my grandparents were cousins, so even though I was digging into my grandmother's side, it blurred into my grandfather's side. So the whole O'Connell family is all related because their grandparents were the same. But then to veer off even more, my grandmother's father was from a whole other family, and I dug deep into them and their history. And I always asked for guidance from my matrilineal line. I asked them to help me overcome patterns that I might be repeating in my waking life. And they connect a lot with me in my dream state. And when I physically visited the land of my people, which was Ireland, I was able to, like I said, touch the soil, drink the water, eat the food. I saw how they lived. My grandfather owned milking cows, and my grandmother had to learn all kinds of things on the farm, how to make butter, how the things that she cooked. Blood sausage was my favorite. I loved it. Never had it in America. And it was one of her favorites too. So it was funny how when I ate it, I was like, oh, it was like I had had it a million times, and I was remembering how wonderful it was, and I had missed it. I watched her salt meat and hang it on the wall because she never owned a refrigerator in her life. It was just amazing for me to watch how they learned from their ancestors how to survive off the land, right? I experienced a deep connection that is extremely powerful in going back to the land my family was from. I stood in castles. So listen, Ireland's a magical place, and my family, there were kings in my lineage. The O'Connells were kings, Curtins were kings, and there is, well, I'll explain my lineage in a minute, but in the part of Ireland that my parents, or grandparents, and my mother is from, there's two actual castles from the O'Connell families. There's said to be 3 different O'Connells that all the O'Connells stem from. But either way, they were magical kings, high kings even. And so to stand there and let your imagination go back to a time and a place and think, geez, just what was it like, right? I remember sitting outside early morning, drinking tea with my grandmother. No one else was awake. And it was a misty, cool morning, and we were sitting on Abbeyfield Hill looking out over all the land. And our family had reign over that land at some point. Most of my family had never moved up north, so they were always on that part of Ireland. So I was looking at the land that all of the generations before me had seen. And there's a strange universal cosmic connection with your ancestors by doing that. And I experienced that. Even now, I can spend entire days researching Irish history and get completely immersed, hours at a time. Nothing I enjoy more than studying Irish mythology. Ireland is a very mystical, magical place for those who don't know. Some say it's the land of leprechauns and fairies and castles and mythology. The Irish have their own mythology. The Greeks don't just own mythology. And honestly, I'm pulled into stories of Irish mythology deeper than anything else. There are cycles of remembering and forgetting, right? That we are fully awakened beings creating this world as we go, how do I explain this? So this is what I believe. I did write it down so I didn't lose my thought. I believe that humans had a cycle, right, where they began as fully enlightened humans. I think some people called these people gods. I think they were divine. They knew their power. They acted like God because they were fully in alignment with God. They were divine. I want to say that there were humans who acted godly and had powers, and then there were fallen angels. I think there were 2. I think the ones that were divine were divine because they were aware of their essence of the Creator that was within them. I believe they were able to manifest instantly by thought. I think they had ancient wisdom of the earth and the energy in the universe. And I think as time progressed, they became more focused on earthly survival and pleasures, maybe. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows why they disappeared. But they did leave monuments, right? In their wake. I think as a reminder to us of who we were. I wonder, God created the earth and humans on it, and maybe they were godly, right? They had power. They knew what they were capable of doing, and they were helped creating the earth as time went on. And then he had a power struggle with the angels. And he couldn't have them in the Holy of Holies of heaven, so he casted them down to the earth. I don't think the original plan was that the demons would have control of the planet. But all things work together for the good of God, right? So maybe it was a plan that he would cast them down to the planet, that the godly people would pass on, or maybe they got in spaceships and went somewhere else because they knew that the evil ones were. I mean, who knows? But my imagination runs wild. Let's say he then had to figure out a plan on how good was going to overcome evil, because evil had taken over a third of the angels. They got casted to the earth. And then he knew that they would have their way with the humans, and he would have to find a way to interject his energy and essence into humans to eventually overcome. Like, isn't that the story of the Bible? Right? That evil was casted to the earth, and that the whole plan then was that Jesus came to give us a way to identify our divine essence again. Of course, I think the evil ones rewrote the Bible and kind of left out or made it confusing as to how we were supposed to get that power back. And then, of course, the timing wasn't right. God didn't plan for us to awaken until now. But here's my point. If we are all on the planet right now, these are the end days. And the point is, the awakening process has begun. And however it was supposed to play out, played out, and here we are. And now it is our choice. Do we want to become new creatures, transfigured, and enter a new kingdom that we will manifest with Jesus, live in the presence of Jesus in peace for 1,000 years before we move on? And I'm sure anyone watching this is saying, yes, I want to be part of that deal. Well, the part of the deal is that we decided to sign a contract to come down here to be the ones to break all the cycles, to clear all the karma, to heal all the baggage from the past. Let that be 5,000 years before Christ even, which would mean 7,000 years of generations that weren't able to do it, or it wasn't their timing. Why? Why did it all happen the way it did? I don't know. I do know that it is quite obvious that the generation that is walking the planet today has been given the opportunity to heal all past trauma, to very soon transform into new creatures, or have we been slowly changing our DNA as we heal? I don't know. I think there's going to be 3 waves. Those that are most awake and have been doing the healing now for years will probably be the first ones transfigured and help harvest the souls for the next 3.5 years. And through their transfiguration, can teach other souls how to do the same, how to become new creations. You have to drop all the baggage. You have to forgive all the sins. You have to let go of all the hate. You have to let go of all the ego. You have to humble yourself, be accountable for the sins that you hold in your cells, in your body, which of course encompass every generation from the beginning of time, in order to be part of the new kingdom that comes. This is why the work is so important. The time is limited. I believe there's 7 years left. I believe the next 42 days, the first wave will be transformed. And we are going to have the prophets and the power that comes with the transfiguration of the first wave. It's going to be mind-blowing, and it's going to show others what's possible. And we will have 3.5 years before the worst of the tribulation happens, before the Antichrist comes, to gather as many souls willing to live in harmony and to find the harmony within themselves and realize the essence of God within them, and be willing to change all behaviors and all thought patterns to be in alignment with Christ, balance the humanity and the divinity in order to go to the new kingdom, to be master manifestors of the new creation. So, with that in mind, I believe that ancestral research then is pretty darn important, you know. In Ireland, the Tua Danann were said to be the enlightened ones originally inhabiting the island of Ireland. The Druids, they were Druids, were enlightened gods who inhabited the land, supposedly surviving the flood of Atlantis. So here's what I learned. There were a lot of people from Atlantis who saw that there were volcanoes going off. They got in ships and they set off. Excuse me. This is what our oral records state. That these so-called gods, I think they were divine humans. I don't think they were fallen angels. I think they were 2 different types of what enlightened humans called gods. Think humans that had divine power. And then the fallen angels, who were giants and had divine power, but for a different reason. And they've always hated humans because humans, at the end times, are going to judge the angels. And they don't think that's fair. At any rate, so we had these druids that supposedly, when Atlantis was sinking, took ships and landed on Spain. So, Spain and France are right under the British Islands. A lot of the DNA that is recorded from the Irish people actually have northern Spain and a little bit of the northern France DNA in it. So that kind of matches all these 1,000 years later of the oral traditions of those Atlanteans going to Spain and settling right there. France is right next to Spain, and in the northern part, a lot of the old names of the ancient ones weirdly can be translated in Spanish. Anyway, so they say that there were several waves of people that came to Ireland. It was uninhabited. Um, Supposedly in the Ice Age, it was completely frozen over. So, because it's a little further north than England. So supposedly, Scotland and Ireland were pretty brutal to be able to survive. There wasn't a lot of food. Everything was ice. You couldn't live there for a certain amount of time. But you could England. So that's why they have different time frames of when people settled where. So we had, that's where all the mythology in Ireland comes from. So those Atlantean people from Spain and France decided to find their own land. And some of them took ships and went, past England. Maybe they tried to go to England and they fought them off. And they went to Ireland then. And, so you'd have to pass the English Channel and go up past England to hit Ireland. And if nobody else was there, and let's say they were gods and they knew how to defrost some of the land or manifest as they went, these were the folks that supposedly made the Stonehenges, and Newgrange is part of the prehistoric Neolithic ancestors' creations that are in the southern part of Ireland where my family is from. And so, inevitably, those the Druids, now don't get me wrong, they were there for a couple thousand years, and then they disappear. So did they leave on purpose? Did they take off? Did they die off? I don't know. There's a lot of mythology that I think as mankind got darker and less enlightened, they couldn't hold the energy. They didn't share the knowledge. The knowledge was lost for whatever reason. Okay, so that's what we know, is that they, the Druids, didn't last forever. And there was another wave of humans that did end up coming to Ireland. A lot of the other DNA, if you're from Ireland, Ireland was a melting pot. There is nobody who originated from Ireland. They didn't just poof appear like Adam and Eve from nowhere in this garden. People came from somewhere to go there. So this second wave of people, if you look at Irish DNA, is from Ukraine. Next to Ukraine. Okay, so let's put it this way. There's a Baltic Sea. On the edge of the sea is Lithuania. Next to Lithuania is Baltero. And next to Baltero is Poland. Yes. This whole region in that Baltic area was Viking people. They were warriors. And they supposedly, it's in everyone's DNA. These were the original settlers as well that came maybe instead of, so the Druids showed up 5,000 years before Christ, and the Baltic people came there about 3,000 to 2,000 years before Christ. They obviously got on a boat on the Baltic Sea. Now, Sweden is above them across the Baltic Sea, and Denmark is next to them. So they went under Sweden, over Denmark, and boom, you're at the Emerald Islands, right? So the Vikings tried very hard to take over England, and a lot of them were very successful. They also did Scotland, and they also did Ireland. But the Druids fought very hard for these people to not invade. They seem to have been, from these people, they seem to have been the successors in establishing farms, and they were farmers. I mean, if they weren't total Viking warriors, the people that they brought over worked the land. They were hunters and gatherers, and they were farmers, and that's the DNA that's in the Irish. If you're from Ireland, you'd be astounded. But how amazing. Ukraine. Isn't that funny, right? I mean, and I my heart goes out to the Ukrainians in the war now, and it makes you wonder, are my people, makes me wonder, are my people being attacked? And are they fighting a good fight of evil? I'm not going to get into politics. I just believe there's a cabal in the system. Ukraine is a very, it's a place where the devil has decided to run the show, and that is the last big fight. And I think the Russians are trying to help the Ukrainians be free of the Ukrainians. I mean, the cabal in Ukraine. Anyway, in saying all of that, how interesting would you find it if I told you that my father who adopted me, his family was Lithuanian. So my father's father, his parents were from Ireland. And the name was Farrell, and they were kings at one point, more on the middle part of Ireland. High kings, but, well, a high king means all of Ireland. They were not high kings, but they were kings and rulers before the big oppressions started. And his grandmother's family was all from Lithuania. My foster parents, that I was very connected to, her mother was from Lithuania. So you cannot tell me our cells didn't have memory, that we were not connected spiritually, that we all were connected somehow, some way. I don't care if it was 20 generations ago, that we all found each other again, and that we've stayed in this family circle. Lithuania, are you kidding me? Of all the places on the planet? Really? I mean, it makes you wonder the miracles of life and the strangeties of things you'll discover. But that was miraculous to me. I found it very magical that was actually part of the history. So, as I began to study the original, so I wanted to go all the way. What was the very first O'Connell that people are with the name are related to? Who was there somebody that everybody's related to? And so there was a king Mac McCulkin. He was called this because he was son of a hound-like one. That's interesting. He had a kingdom of Munster. So Munster is really the whole bottom portion of Ireland. It incorporates 6 counties: Clare, Cork, Kerry, Limerick, Tipperary, and Waterford. Okay? My family is from Limerick, but I have other family from Cork and Tipperary and Kerry. So the point was, though, that my grandparents are from Abbeyfield, Limerick. So most of our family were from Limerick. This Mac McCulkin, they called him Con. They believe that's as far back as the lineage for the O'Connells come from. He had a son, Ichu McNagden. He was king after his father, and he had a son, Neil Negalach. I'm probably destroying the Irish names, trying to pronounce them as much as I can correctly. But he had 5 boys: Connell, Egan, Lugar, Corpray, and a last son named Connell. So when Neil passed away, the oldest son, Connell, ruled as a high king. The kingdom of Munster. A lot of the O'Connells are from this line, and that's why I told you the 3 above him, because obviously they're related to them as well, right? Connell ruled first after his father passed away. What's interesting about the last son's name is also Connell. Why are they both named the same? Well, I found it interesting that back in those days, and we're talking, now we're into 300. Okay, so the 3 generations above that, we're going back into the BCs. So, but in the year 300, it was very common for the Irish families, in order to maintain peace. Ireland was a very, very peaceful country. They fought off the barbarics, right, for a reason, so they could just keep their culture. They could create their own language and have their own traditions and live peacefully. They did not, the kings were not put in rule just because of the bloodline. They had to prove that they were honorable and they were skilled and they were warriors, and there was a long list of things. And if you were the oldest boy from a king and you were not the best choice, then they went to another son, or they went to a cousin, or went to another family. And then if somebody else closer in the lineage became honorable enough to hold the position, then it went back to them. They didn't, I found that very interesting too. You had to earn it. You had to prove that you would be an honorable king. So, interestingly enough, there was some gossip about Neil, who was the king father of Connell, Egan, Lugar, Corpray, and of this other Connell. He fell in love, even though he was married and had a queen, with a Viking girl. Now, she herself probably wasn't a Viking, but she had Viking blood, and it was a no-no. And they had this love child named Connell. The point was that it's very common for families, one clan, to give an enemy clan one of their children. If you were a ruler, you gave your enemy clan one of your children. You sacrificed that for the sake of peace, because that way you were not inclined to attack those people if you knew that your bloodline was in that clan trying to survive and be happy, right? It's painfully beautiful, but I can't believe the sacrifice. But that's how much they wanted peace. All the kings, it was very common for them to give away their children to other clans, to be fostered by their enemies. Mm-hmm. So they named the youngest one, or I should say the father did. Obviously, the mother knew about it. But, and that was the thing, right? I think when they had Connell, the clan had decided that because that even happened, that Neil was now dishonorable. He wasn't, so then his other son, Connell, had to become king when he became of age. Anyway, so this Connell is an interesting fella. He was sent away at birth to live with 2 druid priestesses in the forest after his parents' forbidden love resulted in his birth. He was trained in warfare and told the future, and he was told that he would become king one day if he studied hard and trained hard and fought hard, and he could come back to declare himself a rightful heir of the throne. And he did that. He studied. The Druids had all of the ancient knowledge from Atlantis. So he was very powerful. He was a magical person. He had lots of powers. And I think the Druid priestesses renamed him Finn. And so it kind of gets foggy who the real people are and who the mythological people are, because they have the same names and very similar stories, and you wonder who's who. But there is a guy named Fenton McBachra who is said to be the only survival of the flood and brought back Atlantean knowledge to Ireland. And his name is listed in the Book of Invasions. That's a book that the Irish have. He was said to have lived in Findius. Findius is by Limerick in Ireland in the south. He was supposed to have lived in a mystical forest city that was, and he ruled over all the fairies in Connacht Forest. His throne is at the entrance of the fairy trail. It's a stone that's a throne in the forest. And as you go down the trail, you'll see a little miniature castle. So I don't know. Don't you think he'd be a giant? Instead he was little? He's little like a leprechaun? Maybe that's where the leprechauns came from. Maybe he was a little tiny person. But he ruled over all the fairies. And he had a son named Fioclach McCunkin. Now, this was a magical person as well, because his father taught him all the magic of the Atlanteans, and he was a foster father to Fionn McConnell. Mm-hmm. Well, it's spelled F-I-O-N-N, but it is pronounced Finn. They called him Finn. And he had to be fostered by Fioclach McCunkin. So now we're kind of sounding like the same story of the Connell, of the great king. Well, this Finn McConnell led a band of Irish warriors known as the Fianna. And I just had a dream where all the women in my family from Ireland were having tea with me, and they were saying they were passing the torch to me, and I was part of the Fianna. I had to look that up when I woke up, and it is all the warriors that used to fight off the Vikings they did it just because they had respect and homage for the king and their land, and it was just an army that was of great warriors. Anyway, this Finn McConnell has all kinds of stories. They said he was a giant, and oh no, he wasn't a giant. He fought and slew a giant from Britain, and that giant's name was Brenadin. And he fought him with a magical sword that his foster father gave him. The sword never missed its mark, and it made him a great warrior. And then it was interesting to find out that there was an actual goddess, Abigail Fiel, F-E-A-L-E, Abigail Fiel, that lived in southern Ireland. That was a river goddess of water magic. Turns out, the town my mother lived in, and her family, was Abbey Fiel. It was named after this water goddess who did water magic. And I'm dying to do all kinds more videos about water magic. So see the things you can find. Oh my gosh. So the Grangestone Circles in Limerick, where my family's from, is from the Stone Ages. The very first humans actually arranged them. It's like Stonehenge, but there's 13 stones standing 13 feet high in a circle over a mound. The Irish people were called the Mound people. They got that knowledge from Atlantis. Ancient Egyptians wrote that in the island farthest west, at that time that the Egyptians were writing this, Ireland would have been the farthest island to the west. Said that these people in this land were the keepers of the Atlantis knowledge. They were the scrolls and the poets and the musicians and the magical people whose symbol was the reed. And of course, they made fountain pens from reeds. But yes, there's a lot of history with reeds. Reeds in Egypt and the River Nile, right? But St. Bridget made a cross out of reeds. Lots of history. Everything just collides with each other. And could it be, right? Atlanteans escaped the island and went all over the place. It's just human history. How do you not dive into this, right? So I read something I thought was interesting. It said, to the people who lived in Ireland, fertility was most compelling. They worried. Now I'm talking about the time during the kings, right? They worried, should the land grow sterile and the herds grow barren? Should the rivers not run flush with fish? Then death from starvation would soon follow. The Irish linked the fertility of the land to the king's righteousness. They believed if the king behaved generously, honorably, then the goddess of the land's sovereignty, which they believed was the king's spouse, was the land that he ruled over, would be happy and bear abundantly. Fertility was neither in the domain of the feminine nor the masculine then, but existed in the balance stuck between them. Among the Celts, images of abundance and cornucopia are found both with the gods and the goddesses. Excuse me. Ireland has always had to fight for its sovereignty. First, the Druids had to fight off the Vikings. Then the Celts, for hundreds of years, fought off the Vikings. Um, and then they had to fight off the English, right, for their land and their culture. The English became fixated on oppressing the Irish, starting with Henry VIII, and then finally with King James, who had the Bible written and forced Catholicism on everyone in the 1600s. Now, nothing wrong with Catholicism. I was born a Catholic, but I wonder how much God really wanted Catholicism to turn out the way it did. I think there's a lot of knowledge that's been hidden from us, and they picked and chose what to put in that book. I think what they left out was probably more important for our sovereignty. I don't think God wanted anybody to be oppressed, and He gave everybody good insight onto how to be divine. At any rate, in the 1600s, right, St. James finally, oh my goodness, King James finally won the last battle that removed all of Ireland's kings. And 3 times the English exterminated 2/3 of the Irish population, and 3 times the Irish rebuilt and repopulated. So the fact that I am first generation American states that I came from a line of survivors, a line of warriors. My family survived wars, famine, the plagues of Europe, the oppression of the English, and it makes me grateful to be alive. I thank them every night before I go to bed that they did not give up on life, that they didn't give up on love, that they continued to fight the good fight on earth until they died, and gave me every cell that makes up my body. So King James then decided to make it illegal for, now we're jumping, right? So what I find interesting is we've got kings in our family until about 500 or 600. At that point, St. Patrick came to try to make everyone Catholic. St. Bridget, St. Bridget was doing her thing around 500 or 600. And then you have all the wars and the famine and all the darkness that came upon the earth. And I just think my family, do you see how we started out as, let's say, Atlanteans and Spanish and French and Ukrainian and Lithuanian, and then farmers who became kings and poets and musicians and magical warriors, and then oppressed. They finally lost to their oppressors, and they have been oppressed ever since, right? And now by 1600, not even one king in the island. And now starts a very the darkest time for Ireland. So they made it illegal for any Irish who were Catholic and didn't want to convert to Protestantism. So St. Patrick also brought Catholicism to the island. And then the English wanted to change everyone from Catholic to Protestant. So they couldn't practice their religion, they couldn't own land, and they couldn't vote. So the wealthy kings that were dethroned, now they were cast into the peasant land with no resources. They couldn't bring anything with them. And they had to fend for themselves and their families the best way they saw fit. So only 3 generations later, from a nobleman to a shoemaker or cow milker, nothing wrong with that. That's what my grandparents were. A lot of the O'Connells were bootleggers, right? So they lived in the forest near the ocean, and the merchants would come on the coast at night, and they would sell poachine. Oh, I've got a little thing. This is my poachine jug that my grandmother had. My grandmother made the best liquor of vodka made of potatoes. From potatoes, I should say. So they knew how to make liquor, and they knew how to survive. By the 1600s, late 1600s, yeah, late 1600s, early 1700s. Now, there were a lot of slaves that were sent as the English were taking over the land and taking and oppressing the Irish. They would either send these people to jail or they would just steal them and enslave them. And they would go to the Caribbean to be sold, or Portugal to be sold, and Spain to be sold into slavery. And the Americas would bring them over to America. A lot of people do not know that history, that it was not just the white man going over to Africa to get slaves. They got slaves from Europe. Everybody was a slave. It was who could oppress who. Whoever the lowest and most oppressed persons were, they were the slaves. You could be sold. You didn't have value as a human being, you see. But because there was a movie that he admitted he exaggerated some things and stretched the truth, there was no way that the American people could come over to African continents and steal people. The tribes were way smarter than that. They didn't allow that. A lot of history says they couldn't pass beyond a mile off the ocean into the land. They didn't want to be overrun. They wanted to make their money from selling slaves, and that was it. So they weren't allowed into the country to just pillage through and pick people. Not to say that never happened. I'm not denying that. I don't know if it did or didn't. But I have read plenty of historical statements that say it was not possible for the United States people to come over and just run around the land with those tribes and steal people and get away with it. No, they were stolen. I mean, they were not stolen. They were sold. If there were other tribes that they could take over, they sold. They made money. They traded, whatever. If it wasn't money, it was gold or whatever they traded for. But every country in Europe was, instead of putting people in prison, they would sell you. You would go work somewhere. Some people would let you work for 10 years, work off your crime, and then, I don't know that they would return you to your homeland, but at least you'd be set free to earn money to save to get back to your homeland. And that is what happened with one of my family members on my grandmother's father's side, which I'll tell in a minute. But so what I'm saying is, by the end of the 1600s, right, now we're oppressed by the English. A lot of people were fleeing the country and going to U.S. And whatever they would be doing, it does say that even the earliest families that were going to Europe or other countries and making a living for themselves would send something by ship back to their family clan, whether it was send them something that they could trade, or whether it was some type of food or clothing, or they would send things of substance back to the families to help them survive. What else? Let's see. So the English eventually became large landowners, and the Irish were having to rent tiny bits of land, farm only what they could eat, and families often had to unite with other clans to fight off the English military to just keep what little bits of land they had. In the 1800s, potato famine almost completely wiped out all of the Irish. 1 million deaths were from starvation, and 1 million left the country. So now we're talking about the 1800s, right? Again, a third of the population is now gone. English families owned most of the land, and most Irish Catholics were relegated to work as tenant farmers, forced to pay rent, kind of like you will own nothing and be happy. Where have we heard that before? The crops were failing in 1845. You know that they actually, I think it was the Americans who brought over the potato for the Irish, and it was only one color potato. It was one family of potato species. When the Indians knew the only way that you can grow a healthy potato crop is to have different kinds of potatoes growing together, because they would balance the fungus and the bacteria, and the only way you can have a healthy crop is to plant different species together. You can't just have one. And that's what the Irish did. After they planted maybe 3 generations of the same potato, the bacteria learned how that they could eat that species of potato. 1 year, the crops were all failing. And then Queen Victoria placed tariffs on grains, bread, and corn products, so they were all too expensive to purchase. This is a poem regarding the potato famine. Barefoot mothers wore clothes dripping from their bodies, clutched dead infants in their arms as they begged for food. Wild dogs searching for food fed on human corpses. The Irish starving, fed on tufts of grass in futile attempts for survival. Desperate farmers sprinkled their crops with holy water, then scraped Ireland's stubbled fields with eyes as hollow as their stomachs, searching for one, just one healthy potato. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and cholera tore through the countryside as horses maintained a constant march, carting dead bodies to mass graves. British, now depraved Ireland's Catholics of their rights to worship, vote, speak the Irish language, own land, horses, and guns. So now they're depraved of food. But, they yielded plenty of healthy crops during that time. They grew barley and wheat and a lot of other foods that they could have lived off of. But if the English owned the land that the Irish were farming, then under armed guard, the farmers growing wheat, oats, and barley were forced to export their goods to England while the Irish starved. So Ireland's population was halved, cut in half by 1852. And I heard that in 1997, Tony Blair, which is the Prime Minister of England, he officially apologized for the way the English had handled that crisis, which I'm sure meant nothing to them at that point. But, so let's talk about my grandmother's family. So as I did my research, let's go to, all right. My grandmother and my grandfather come from the same family, right? So let's go 2 generations above my grandparents. That's as far back as I could go with them. And, specifically, which is 1798 Um, and it's several hundred years. Well, it's 1,000 years. 1,000 years. So the O'Connells were kings until 1200, and then I don't get anything else until 1700. So, oh no, so there's 500 years. 500 years where they were just surviving, perhaps most of them dying, and fighting and trying to survive. And then all of a sudden, 1798, we get Donacod O'Connell, who married May McCarney. And they had an older son named Donica O.G. O'Connell. And he married Lizzie Collins. And that was, I don't know when they got married, but Donica was born in 1820, right? So, it is this big guy. He was a big character. Anyone who knew him said everyone in the county knew him. He was a jokester, but he was a good man. He always found a way to help people who were in need. He provided for his family. He was a fighter. He was an entertainer. He told stories. He played music. He was rowdy. He got in trouble. I don't know. I think he was pretty loyal to his wife, but they said he was a character. So, this Donica O'Connell had so he had Tatey and Nora and Mary and Johanna and Ellen and Bridget and Thomas and Elizabeth and Margaret. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So they had 9 children. Their oldest child, Tatey, in 1847, married Catherine, or Kate, Broderick. Okay? So this Tatey, the firstborn of Donica Og. And Donica is Donald. So Donica Og O'Connell, that big life person, had an older son, Tatey, who married Katie, and they had 13 children. Those 13 children consisted of my grandfather, and 12 other kids. I'm trying to read this. I'm so sorry. So my grandfather's father was Tim. Tim had a sister, Mary. Mary married a Curtin. Is that correct? Mary O'Connell, married an Ahern. You know who they had? They had 12 children, and a girl named Beatrice was born of them. So, I had to go back because my family had told me something different, and everyone was confused. In my family, everybody named everybody the same. So, everybody had 10 children and named them after all the children that was in the previous generation. It's hard to tell what generation was what, and then they married cousins, and it got really confusing. So, bear with me. Okay, my point was that, Tim had my grandfather. Tim had a sister, Elizabeth, who married a John Curtin, and they produced my grandmother. So Tim had my grandfather, and his sister, Elizabeth, had my grandmother. So they were first cousins. Okay? But there was 30 years difference between Tim and his sister, Elizabeth. So the age difference was huge. So they were quite separate in age. And then they also had a sister Mary. So Tim had my father, his sister Elizabeth had my grandmother. Talking about my grandparents here. And then there's another character in my life named Beatrice, who was their sister Mary's child. Okay, that was an Ahern family. A lot of the Aherns married Curtins. So it got really confusing with that too. But, so we know that then my grandmother's mother was an O'Connell, and so all of her history would have been exactly the same as my grandfather, right? Because his father was an O'Connell, and all the father's history was the same. So that kind of leaves it easy, right? As far as tracing back roots. And so, since I could only go back my mother, my grandmother, and then 2 more generations, I started asking more questions about the Curtin family. The Curtin family. So, my grandmother, her mother was Elizabeth and her father was John. They came from John David Curtin, who married Ellen O'Neill in 1808. They came from David Daniel Curtin, and he was born in 1775. But David Daniel Curtin had a brother who in 1760 was born, and his name was John Taddeo Curtin. He is the one who became a slave. So now we're talking 2 generations above my grandmother. On her father's side, her great-grandfather was brother to this John Taddeo Curtin. And so I'll tell the story very quickly. John Taddeo was renting some little land, and we were not making the bills because none of the crops were surviving, and they weren't even able to feed the family. So they were kicked off their land, and he didn't want to have, he was a proud man and didn't want the family to have to worry about him. Everybody was in survival mode. I'm not sure who felt capable of providing for anybody else. It's a burden when you have a lot of children. You can't just show up at someone's door, right, and say, hey, take care of us too, we're starving. Sometimes it is easier, though, to take care of your family, all pitched together. But anyhow, they decided supposedly to go, so Limerick isn't too far from the ocean. They decided to go towards the ocean where they could fish and, I don't know. Did they think they were going to live off the land forever? Did they think something miraculous was going to happen? Not sure what was going on, but they ended up by the ocean side having to fish and survive, and then they lived, so by the ocean were caves, and you could find shelter in there and live for free. So, don't know. That's where they ended up, and winter came, and it was a struggle. The shores were frozen, fish weren't coming closer to the land. They were starving. So he decided to go a little north, which was out of the Munster, and so you know what? I'm gonna just steal somebody's animal, and we'll cut it up, and we will salt it, and we'll be able to make it through this winter. And that was his decision, and it was a poor decision because he got caught, and it was an Englishman who he took the animal from, and He said, no, I don't want to send him to jail. I'm going to sell him. He sold him into slavery for that. And he was gone for 10 years. His family did not know what happened to him. I suppose later they found out. I don't know a lot of details. You know, when people are orating this history, they don't fill you with all the details, just most important stuff. So, at any rate, he went to the Caribbean and was sold there to a farmer, a plantation owner from Portugal. But when he was in the Caribbean, he told of the stories to his people later that millions of Irish were being slaved and transported to the U.S. And they were coffin ships. Half the people would survive the trip, the other half would end up being slaves. So, let it be known that Irish were among the very first slaves in the United States, not just black people, and I'm sure there were plenty of other cultures who did the same thing because all of Europe was selling into slavery. So, but that's a lot of reason, right, why the Irish were so frowned upon for so long in the Americas, because they were slaves. That's why they were not looked upon highly when they were trying to get their freedom and become, landowners and things. They were the riffraff of society because they used to be slaves. So they got the same type of reputation as, the African Americans say happened to them. Okay, so going back to him, so when he was in Portugal, so he had to be a slave for 10 years or so. This is what the oration is. I don't know what the truth is. There's no documentation. So I was told for 10 years he was a slave. He worked off his time. The landowner was gracious enough to grant him his freedom when the time came, and he began working then to save for a trip on a boat. He had to get on a boat from Portugal, which is connected to Spain. All he had to do was take a trip straight up, right? Because that's where the Atlanteans were. They were right there in the north of Spain, right where Portugal is. And all they did was take one little trip straight up to hit Ireland. So he needed some money for that, and it took him years to save for that. And he got on a boat, and he made his way to Ireland, and he went home to find out that his wife, when he didn't return with any food, starving in the middle of winter, took her children and walked, had to have been days. If the clan was in Limerick, from where the ocean is, it was days of walking in order to survive. Went back to the clan, asked for help, started working for Englishmen as a servant, but being paid, and still had her freedom, and saved enough money and said, we're out of here. She got on a ship and she went to America to meet some other family members who were already there. She stayed in New York and she raised her children working as a maid, supposedly, to give her kids a better life. What a story. Both of them, not knowing what had happened to either of them, both worried about their families, both killing themselves to make a better life. Both of them were so strong. Both of them. And so I wonder, all that trauma, separation of family, enslavement, oppression, starvation, war. I cry for them sometimes at night. I really do. And what a man to work as a slave, punished for just wanting to feed his family, and did his time, paid his debt, paid his karma, and then he gets to Ireland and finds out his family had been gone. Gone. So here's the good thing. He was able to work a little longer, save money, get on a ship, and eventually meet his family. And so that was the blessing, right? God blessed them by reuniting them. They never gave up hope. She never remarried. She never loved anybody again. And she was working darn hard to make sure that she was going to do better for her children. And God bless them both. So I got a little mixed up with my family's stories until I realized they stayed in New York. Okay? And now we're talking, they had children. They had John David. The Curtins did there. John David moved to Chicago from New York to provide a better life for his family. And that was a family that worked in the slaughterhouses in Chicago and became police officers, flatfooters. They joined the army. And that is who a lot of the family had then been able to write to. See, just those two, that one family that went to New York and said, we're going to try to have a better life. They provided a way for the rest of the family to come to the Americas, to have a place of refuge. So even though they weren't well off, they were more well off than where they were. But the important thing is they provided a portal for the rest of the clan, a place for them to come. You can stay with us. We'll find you, John. The more people that came, the more they could put their money together and help each other, build each other up. So it's really miraculous on both sides of the ocean what was going on with the families and how they were helping each other survive. I find it just absolutely fascinating. But yes, the Curtins, as much as I marvel at the O'Connells, wow, the Curtins were something. They were a great family too. I'm looking at the time, and I would still love to talk. There's so much history, so much history. We will stop there because, we haven't even talked about my grandparents' experience and my mother's experience. And I did want to touch on how the trauma was still experienced generation after generation. The separation, the separation of family, the addiction. We had a lot of alcoholics in our family. A lot of pains and a lot of traumas. So I am actually going to end it with that story on a good note that he found his way back to his family, John Curtin did, and lived in New York until he died, and had family that moved to Chicago, and that's where I was born. And in the meantime, 2 more generations were going on in Ireland, and that's when my grandmother was born. And I would like to tell you a lot of that history between Ireland and Americas, how the great exodus of Ireland happened, how my mother got to America. And there's a lot more of the story to tell. So I hope you enjoyed that part of the story. If you're interested, please watch the next video, and I might be able to get through another couple of generations. Um, I'm just hoping I inspire you to try to do some digging for yourself so that you can know where you're coming from, have a sense of belonging in the human experience, and know that God loves you. He's creating new creatures now. He's calling for you to heal yourself and start fresh in a brand new created world and kingdom. And like the curtains, who said, let's be pioneers. Let's go see. Let's go see what God has to give us. And they found cornucopia. So I'm hoping in this video to inspire you to figure out who your ancestors were. Do some digging, ask questions, do some research, make it fun. Keep notebooks of written material. Go to Ancestor.com, read the census. My mother's name is in the book from Ellis Island. Get together with family and have a history night. Tell stories. That's what I encourage you to do. So, until we meet again, from my heart to yours, I wish you healing and love. Remember that God deserves love back. You are good enough. You deserve love. I love you. God loves you. Good luck in looking up your family history. And I will continue my story in our next video. Have a good night.